They showed up at 5:30 in the morning, right when the mist was still clinging to the hollows of the Blue Ridge, and honestly, the only reason I even woke up was the low-frequency thrum of a diesel engine that didn't end oppose. Sound like any tractor I owned. I remember sitting there on the edge of my bed, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and feeling that old military instinct kick in, that prickle on the back of your neck that says something isn't right in your perimeter. So I pulled on my boots and stepped out onto the porch with a cold cup of coffee, just in time to see a bright yellow excavator crawling over my south ridge like a giant prehistoric beetle. Now, you have to understand, I bought this place, 85 acres of the finest rolling pasture in western North Carolina, specifically because I didn't end oppose. Want to see his soul, after 20 years in the Army and 2 tours that I still don into oppose. Talk about a dinner. I just wanted to raise my cattle, fix my fences, and listen to the wind through the pines. But there they were, a crew of guys in high-visibility vests acting like they owned the place, and by the time I hiked down there, they had already gouged a 50-foot trench through my prime grazing land, flipping over rich black topsoil like it was common trash. I shouted at the operator to shut it down, but he just pointed a thumb toward a white SUV parked near my gate where a guy named Sterling Vance was leaning against the hood, looking every bit the part of a high-end real estate shark in a tailored polo and loafers that had never seen a day of real work. Sterling was the president of the Oak Ridge Heights HOA, a new development that had sprouted up on the neighboring ridge like a fungus, all cookie-cutter mansions and manicured lawns that required way too much chemical fertilizer. And he looked at me with this smirk that just made my blood simmer. He didn't oppose to even apologize. He just tapped his clipboard and told me they were, end quote, implementing a community-wide hydrological stabilization initiative, end quote, because their new infinity pools and paved cul-de-sacs were causing runoff issues, and apparently his board of directors had decided that my farm was the most, end quote, logistically sound, end quote, place to dump their excess water. I told him he was trespassing on private property, that I had a deed dating back to the 40s and not a single easement signed by my hand. But he just chuckled, that dry, condescending laugh of a man who spent his life bullying people with fine print, and said, end quote, Eli, Don and Oppos. To be difficult, the county maps are being updated as we speak, and in the interest of the greater community, sometimes the few have to accommodate the many, end quote. I spent the next 3 days in a state of cold, focused fury, watching from my porch as they laid down sections of heavy-duty concrete culverts and dug a channel 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide that effectively sliced my property in half, leaving my breeding bulls on one side and my main hay barn on the other. It wasn't oppose, just a ditch. It was a moat, a permanent scar that meant I couldn't and oppose get my Massey Ferguson across to the lower pasture without driving 3 miles around the county road. And every time I tried to block the path with my truck, the local sheriff, a guy who played poker with Sterling every Friday, would show up and tell me it was a, end quote, civil matter, end quote, and that I shoot an oppose, end quote, obstruct progress, end quote. That's when I realized that being the loudest guy in the room was, and oppose, going to win this, because Sterling had the money, he had the local board, and he had the arrogance of a man who thought a farmer was too simple to understand the law. So I stopped shouting, I went back inside, I opened up my old trunk from my service days, and I started looking at my land not as a farm, but as a tactical map. And I realized that if they wanted to build a canal to protect their precious little subdivision, they had forgotten one very important detail about the topography of this valley. The first thing I did was hire a surveyor from 2 counties over, a guy who didn't oppose, care about local politics, and I had him pin every square inch of that trench, confirming what I already knew. They were 30 feet inside my property line at the narrowest point, and they hadn't oppose. Filed a single environmental impact study with the state. Then I called an old buddy of mine, a civil engineer I'd served with in the Corps, and I asked him exactly what kind of load-bearing capacity a, end quote, community drainage feature, end quote, like that had. He just laughed and said, end quote, Eli, if they didn't oppose, reinforced the bed with steel mesh concrete. It's basically just a glorified puddle with a price tag, end quote. That was all I needed to hear, so I went down to the local rental yard, put down a cash deposit on a heavy-duty backhoe, and a vibratory roller, and I spent 72 hours straight hauling in loads of crushed granite and river rock, working under the cover of the mountain mist until the sun came up. I didn't in Oppos. T touched their canal. I didn't in Oppos. T sabotaged their pipes. I did something much better. I built a massive, over-engineered, rock-solid crossing right through the center of their project, a bridge of sorts that sat on giant steel culverts I'd salvaged from a bridge demolition, and I topped it with a layer of packed gravel, so thick a tank could have driven over it without leaves rattling. The morning I finished, I was sitting on my tractor, idling right in the middle of my new road, when Sterling's SUV came flying up the access path, dust billowing behind him like a storm cloud, and he jumped out looking like he was about to have an aneurysm. He started screaming about, in quote, unauthorized structures, in quote, and in quote, environmental sabotage, in quote, claiming that my bridge was obstructing the flow and that the HOA was going to sue me into the Stone Age for ruining their drainage system. I just sat there, leaning on the steering wheel, and I handed him a laminated sheet of paper that I'd spent all night preparing. It was a formal, in quote, notice of agricultural necessity and land reclamation, in quote, backed by a temporary injunction I'd secured from a circuit judge who actually respected the state's Right to Farm Act. I told him, in quote, Sterling, you wanted a canal and you got one, but I need to get to my cows, and since you neglected to build me a bridge on my own land, I figured I'd do the community a favor and build it myself. End quote. He was shaking, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the bougainvillea in his front yard, and he told me that by Monday his crews would be there to tear it down and bill me for the cost. But Monday didn't in Oppos go the way he planned, because when his demolition crew showed up, they were met at the gate by 3 state environmental inspectors and a deputy from the Attorney General's office, all because I'd spent my weekend sending photos of the HOA's, in quote, stabilization initiative, in quote, to the Department of Environmental Quality. It turns out that when you divert thousands of gallons of chlorinated pool water and chemically treated lawn runoff into a protected trout stream, which just happened to be the creek at the bottom of my hill, the state gets real interested real fast. They didn't in Oppos. T care about Sterling and Oppos. S, in quote, community interest, in quote. They cared about the fact that the Oak Ridge Heights HOA had bypassed every single federal water regulation in the book, and suddenly, that canal wasn't in Oppos a feature anymore. It was a multi-million-dollar liability. The inspectors stood there on my new road, nodding at how well built it was, while they issued a, in quote, cease and restore, in quote, order that required the HOA to not only stop their work, but to fill in the entire trench, replace my topsoil, and pay me for every blade of grass they disturbed. The look on Sterling's face during the final hearing in the county courthouse is something I'll take to my grave with a smile, because he sat there in that same charcoal suit, watching as the judge, a woman who grew up on a tobacco farm and had zero patience for developers, tore into his legal team for their, in quote, flagrant disregard for private property rights and environmental stewardship, end quote. She didn't in Oppos. T just rule in my favor. She awarded me 3 times the value of the land aid, damaged in punitive damages, and she ordered the HOA to pay for a permanent, paved access road across the property to replace the one I'd built out of spite. For the next month, I got to sit on my porch with a beer and watch the same yellow machines come back. Only this time, they were working for me, carefully shoveling the dirt back into the hole, pulling out those concrete pipes, and tilling the soil until the land looked like a farm again. Sterling ended up resigning from the board after the residents found out their monthly dues were doubling just to pay off the fines in my settlement. And I heard he moved down to the coast, though I doubt the people down there will like him much better. Now, my fields are green again, the cows are back to grazing where they belong, and that gravel road I built, I kept it, and it stands there as a reminder to anyone who thinks they can just walk over a man's life because they have a fancy title and a clipboard. People in town call it, in quote, Eli's Crossing, in quote, and sometimes I see the folks from the subdivision driving by, looking over at my fence line with a mix of awe and fear, wondering if the old guy on the hill is as crazy as the rumors say. But, it makes me wonder, did I go too far by cutting a road through their, in quote, community dream, in quote, or is a man's dirt the only thing left in this world worth fighting for? I've seen communities torn apart over less, and I've seen people give up their rights just to avoid a headache. But out here, the land has a memory, and it doesn't in Oppos. Forget who stood up for it. So, I'm curious, if you woke up and found a bulldozer in your backyard, Would you call a lawyer and wait for a year, or would you get in the dirt and draw a line of your own? Is the "and" quote, greater good and quote, just a fancy way of saying and quote, my lawn matters more than your life and quote, or did I just become the very thing I hated, a neighbor who refused to compromise? Let me know what you think in the comments, because in this valley, everyone's got an opinion, but only one of us has the deed.